Alright, A&P1 lab students, in this video I am going to cover Lab 4 and kind of go over the information in the lab packet and so kind of give you an idea of where you can find the information and some helpful tips on how to cover the lab content. So this is, again, Lab 4, and we have two labs, Lab 4 and 5, that we split the skeletal system up in. So we'll talk about the skeletal system in this week's lab, and then we'll talk about it in next week's lab as well. So the first objective that I will give you an idea of where you can find the information is the characteristics and some examples of the different shapes of bones in the body. And so they kind of refer to this as classifying the bones based on their shape. And there's 4 particular shapes. And so if you go to your textbook, let me get to our picture here. It's on page 215, yep, if I recall. So 215, they have a picture here, and then they also have a description of the 4 shapes that bones may be placed into, as far as their which one they look most resemble as far as shape. So there's 4 different shapes, and those you should be familiar with the definition of those shapes, and then also be able to look at a bone and kind of place it into the proper category, whether it's considered a short bone, a long bone, a flat bone, or an irregular bone. So the thing that is tricky with these that I find, so I want to make sure people are aware of it, is the long bones. Obviously those are the ones that are in the arms and the legs primarily. And so the main ones in the arms and legs are pretty long. But realize that their definition for a long bone is that it's longer than it is wide. So that means that even the bones that are in the hand and in the fingers, those bones, and also in the foot and the toes, if you look at those, they are, even though they're much smaller than, say, like the femur or the humerus, they are longer than they are wide, so they're still considered long bones based on their shape. So that's the little tricky part, I think, with that. And the short bones aren't necessarily short. Short means that their width and their length are about the same. So they're more bones that are more kind of square or cube shaped, approximately, not perfectly. And so that makes them fit into the category of our classification as short. So you can find that first objective in your textbook. The next objective is the long bone anatomy. So if we were to look at all the long bones in our body, they have particular areas on them that we can refer to, and we do refer to describe. So we use these terms to describe the area that we are talking about within a long bone. So probably the best way to, and these are the 5 structures, kind of characteristics on a long bone that you'll need to identify. Probably the best way to find that information is to go to your lab learning tools, slide down to Lab 4 skeletal system, and then look at the pictures, and we'll pull up long bone and the osteons on here, but we'll look at the long bone first. So there's an image of the bone, one of the bones that we have in lab. You don't see the whole long bone, the rest of it's that way, but you can definitely see all the parts that you need to see. So the name of the end of the long bone, and the middle of the bone, and the various parts. So that's the best place to find that information. And remember that we do have videos. So if we just go back a couple times here, above the pictures was videos and audio podcast, but there is videos that you can watch where someone kind of goes over those various parts of a long bone as well as other parts of the skeletal system. So those are helpful, especially if you can't attend lab. Those are helpful to listen to, so you hear somebody talking about the various parts of the long bone or any of the other parts of the skeletal system. So that's where you can find that information. And then our third objective is the osteon. And this is where we're looking more at microscopic anatomy of the bone. So the rest of lab, mainly we're looking at the gross anatomy, those things we can see without a microscope. But this number 3, we want you to identify structures that you'll see when you look at bone under the microscope. So this is actually compact bone. These are the structures that you will see. So I'm going to show you the picture that we had in lab 3, and that represented bone tissue. So hopefully everybody remembers that that's bone tissue. We'll make it bigger. And then this structure right here, we're kind of looking at a piece of, like, think of a long bone where you kind of cut it perpendicular to its axis and then you look end on at it. What you'll see if you have a microscope are these circular structures. So here's one full circular structure, and then you can kind of see the edges of some more here. So here's like part of another one, part of another one. So that's what our compact bone is made up of, is these long cylindrical. So when you cut them perpendicular to their long axis, they look like these round structures, but they're long cylindrical structures that make up compact bone. And each one of those long cylindrical structures is called an osteon. And so this is an osteon. So one osteon, and then you can see parts of others around the edge here. So it's so in this particular osteon, we want you to be able to identify the parts of the osteon, where the cells are, the structures that are there to provide a place for blood to get to various cells in the bone tissue, and so that's our osteon. So now in lab, we don't have you identify these parts on the microscope, this slide that we have here. We have you identify them with a model that we have in lab, and I'll pull up under pictures in Blackboard is where you can find under the long bone is where they have the osteon. So it definitely doesn't look like the microscopic one picture that we just looked at, but hopefully you can appreciate that we have this circular structure and we're looking end on at it. And so this model is representing one osteon, and then there's like a start of another one, but this model, is not showing that osteon, but you can see this whole full osteon, and so it has the structures marked, and you'll have a key for those two. So that is where you can find the information for the osteon. Number 4 has to do with the components that make up that bone tissue. So like the microscopic picture we just looked at, the slide of bone tissue. So if the little ions and molecules that are actually part of that bone tissue, you should know that collagen is the primary protein in bone. So collagen is one component of bone. And then the other component we want you to know is the mineral salts. So think about these as minerals or ions. So those are primarily calcium and phosphorus, but there's other minerals in the bone too. So what we want you to know and what we'll ask questions about is, because there's collagen in the bone, what property does that bring to bone? So if collagen is that fiber that's in our skin as well, so it's more of a flexible protein fiber, so it is going to bring some flexibility to our bone. So that's the role of collagen in bone tissue. And then the calcium and the phosphorus and all the other minerals that you can find in bone, the property that's having minerals like calcium and phosphorus in the bone, that brings the property of being very hard. So we have both of those in the right combination in our bone tissue, then our bones are healthy and they can support our weight, and they can also flex a little bit to everyday stresses, so they don't break easily. So that's the proper you should have these components in bone, and they should be in the proper amounts each, so that way bone's healthy. So there'll be questions that ask, like, what property brings the hardness to bone, and you would say mineral salts, or sorry, what component of bone brings the hardness to bone? You say mineral salts. Or what component brings flexibility to the bone? You'd say collagen. So there's going to be a couple questions on the practice test over that. Okay, and then objective 5 is identify the major bones of the axial and appendicular skeleton. So probably the best picture that I can find for showing the difference between those two parts of the skeleton is in our textbook. So let me run to our textbook here. There we go. So this is on page 242. And what it's showing is the full skeleton. And they've colored in blue the bones that are part of the axial skeleton. So you'll notice that they're all the bones that make up the head and the chest and the spine there. So those are considered part of the axial skeleton. And that's what this lab 4 is going to focus on, is having you identify the bones that make up the axial skeleton. So you'll learn about the cranial bones and facial bones, the ribs, the sternum, the vertebral bones in this lab. And then the other part of the skeleton that's not blue is the appendicular skeleton. So appendicular refers to appendage. So that's the part of the skeleton that's forming the arms and the legs. So that is what we'll focus on in Lab 5, which we'll cover next week. So that is our appendicular and axial skeleton. Okay, so now we're getting into actually identifying bones in the skeleton. Now realize we also are going to not only identify the major bones that are located in the cranium and the face and that make up the spine, but we also want you to be familiar with some of the bone markings or surface markers that are on those bones. And what a bone marking or a surface marker means is that is where something significant happens on that bone. So it might have a name because that's where a joint happens. That's a place where that bone connects to another bone. It might be a place where a muscle attaches, so then it'll have a name. It might be a place where a nerve passes through it. There's like a hole in the bone, so a nerve can get from one part of the body, from to the other. So that might be why it's got a name. So that's what we mean when we say bone markings or surface markers. There's significant areas on the bone where things happen. So how we have our lab packet set up is we have the cranial bones first, so part of the cranium. And so these are the bones, and they're in bold, and they also have bone behind them. So you're going to identify the frontal bone, parietal bone, there's 2 of those, temporal bone, 2 of those, occipital bone, there's just 1 of those, sphenoid and ethmoid bone. So those are going to be the bones of the cranium. And then for the facial bones, you have the mandible bone, nasal bone, zygomatic bone, lacrimal bone, palatine, maxillary, vomer. So those are and hyoid's not really a facial bone, but it's close to the skull, so we've kind of included it here. But it's kind of the bone that doesn't really belong with any other bones, so it kind of gets its own little special place. So those are the bones that you'll need to identify. And then if you look below some of the bones, you'll notice like the frontal bone. There are 2 bone markings or surface markings. So there's a supraorbital margin and a supraorbital foramen, or you can call it a supraorbital notch. You don't have to call it both. You can kind of pick which one.